the trust the people ones, and this is what brought us back to a really big insight, which is that change happens at the speed of trust. In trust the process, and the great organizations out there, I think Procter & Gamble is a good one that gets mentioned when it comes to the manufacturing guys. I think General Electric used to be very much in that scale as well, where literally central process, it just changes through command and control on your way through. Now, on the other side of things, any organization where it's trust the people, you have to get to a tipping point. And the tipping point isn't bottom up. The tipping point is top down. When the minute a leader buys into a change, genuinely buys into it, the rest of their tribe will come with them. So in answer to your question, it's not industry focused, it's cultural, and it's cultural based on structure and background and history of the organization.
Welcome to episode 41 of the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing and enabling organizational change. My name is Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today, my guest is Edwina Pike, a change thought leader, a behavioralist, and a self-proclaimed change wizard, but to me at least. Leading the Irrational Change organization, Ed is the architect and innovator behind a transformational approach full of behavior-based brain hacks and strategies that put organizations back in control. In this episode, Ed and I chat about how Irrational Change exposes some of the common myths around change practices and promotes practical ways to manage change more effectively. I am grateful to have Ed chatting with me today. Well, Ed, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. Eternally grateful that you've given me some time and agreed to chat with me today.
Thank you, Ali. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Today, we're going to talk about irrational change. That's your forte. Just give me one change that is rational, but we'll dive deep into it. But before we start, it will be fantastic if you introduce yourself to my audience, Ed.
Thank you, Ali. So my name's Ed Pike, short for Edwina. I am a change agent. I've been a change agent for over 30 years. I am a field practitioner. I spent a lot of my time in corporate life wondering why change was so hard. I believe that humans are special beings, but I also believe that there is a better way of doing things. There's an engineer at the heart of me. So about 4 years ago, I broke away from the corporate world. I took the big leap and I said, you know what? There is a better way of doing change. I've practiced it for the last 15 years. Let's go share it. So for the last 4 years, I have my own advisory practice, and I'm also the innovator and creator behind something called Irrational Change, which we're going to talk about today. Yeah, my style, quite disruptive, simplifying things right down. So expect some things that may challenge your thinking a little bit.
So when you say disruptive, can you elaborate on that?
Actually, this goes back. I did an MBA probably about 15 years ago. And in my education, they taught me to challenge. They taught me to say, so what? And I stopped just listening and saying, yes, that must be the answer. And I started actually going deeper and saying, well, what's the root cause behind something? Why does something really happen rather than just accepting the received wisdom? As a practitioner, I try things. So my disruptiveness comes out of the fact that actually some of the things that we are told, some of the things that are out there as being accepted practices in our world of change, I don't think they work. And I've got the guts to say, I don't think they work. And this is the reason why I'm saying that. And that's the reason and the passion behind what we do in Irrational Change, which is saying, hey, guys, we're missing a trick here. We're missing a trick to work smarter, not harder. Let's blow up some of the myths that we had previously. Let's look at things differently.
What would be some of the myths that you keep hearing about?
Well, this is where the name Irrational Change comes from.
Yes.
So when you look at most of the change approaches that are out there, they make assumptions about a rational approach to change. That if you do step A, step B, you create the awareness, you create the desire, you create the knowledge, people are going to choose to do things differently. Well, the environment has changed. That worked 20 years ago when they were first designed. And in fact, most of the approaches that are out there that are seen as being regular were designed in the 2000s. And if you think back to 2000, that was 10 years before the iPhone. The internet had probably been going for about 5-10 years. If you actually think back that far, email was sort of happening, text messaging, SMSing, well, that wasn't really, that was sort of happening. But the world was very, very, very different. If I go back to the early part of my career 30 years ago, we used to go to meetings. We used to have minutes. We used to have in trays. We used to send minutes around with brown envelopes. So it's a very, very different world that at the time was driven by the received wisdom that it was all about efficiency and process. Yeah. And that you could have a rational approach. And that if you had a logical, rational approach, people would believe it, they would accept it, and they would change. Well, our environment has changed, and the approach we have to change needs to change with it.
And our brains don't work always the same way. And the second thing is there was a discussion today that I had with a client, and not only the environment has changed, and so it challenges us as practitioners to continuously think of better ways to manage. But even throughout the timeline of a project, things change. New leaders come in, new leaders leave, old leaders leave, new project managers. So anything beyond 6 months or even 3 months, expect that there's going to be a change within the timeline. I actually used an analogy. DJs understand that if you've got two consoles exactly with the same track, if you leave them together, at some stage they'll be out of sync. And so the DJ's job is continuously lining up. And they create music. And so for us, we can create music by continuously lining up, the expectations for the business, for the stakeholders, for the users, and for the project group. I want to go back to, in simple words, define irrational change.
So irrational change is change that is human-centric, more human-centric than most. At the heart of it, and where it gets its name from, is behavioral science. And picking up on a point you just made, Ali, you said, our brains don't always work the same way. Well, actually, in the study of behavioral science, when our brains are cognitively overloaded, we take a bunch of shortcuts known as cognitive biases.
Yes.
And the study of behavioral science says that these are predictable. It's the same biases that are used for gambling companies. It's the same biases used for online shopping. If you've ever been to eBay, you're being streamed down, or Amazon or any online shopping, you're being streamed down a bunch of biases. Now, these are biases that we use to survive in our modern world because our modern world is just too crazy. Yes. There's too much data coming towards us. The reason why we call ourselves Irrational Change is behind Dan Ariely. Now, he was one of a suite of behavioral scientists. So Daniel Kahneman is another one. And around the 2010s, there was a lot of stuff that was being written. And this was the point when we went, aha, we should be using this in the same way it gets used in user design, the same way it gets used actually by scammers, the same way it gets used by others. And I'm not suggesting we scam anybody here, but it's the same behavioral characteristics that our brains all solve problems exactly the same way. And they solve them that way when they feel that they're stressed. There's a great paper by RU on how stress propitiates decision making. That the more stressed you are, the more likely you are to take one of these shortcuts.
Yeah.
Now, these shortcuts are highly predictable. And as Dan Ariely would say it, we are, as humans, we're irrational, but we are predictably irrational. Now, what we do is we put that predictability at the heart of an approach to change. So we can very, very quickly predict the likely success or failure of a change. We can very, very quickly use these nudges in the right way to nudge the behaviors of those that need to change. So we turn the thing upside down a little bit and say, right, actually, what is going to cause this individual to change? And it's not the regular stuff you think about. Yep. How is their brain going to work in a stress state? And in fact, that's our biggest assumption. We assume that nobody involved in our change, stakeholders, sponsors, project team, those that are change targets, is rational. We assume that they are all completely under stress in our working environment. We're all looking at productivity, how to do more with less people. So everybody feels like pretty stressed out. So we assume every human that we come into contact with is irrational. And we treat them through that irrational lens. So everything we do has irrationality at the heart of it. I'm hoping that's answered your question.
Yes. And I just want to add to that is that I think what you're talking about is when we are going through a state of threat, which you talked about as stress.
Correct.
We default to the stuff that we know, which is what you describe as the shortcuts.
No, actually, not necessarily the stuff that we know. That's bizarre. So there is a regression thing where you'll go back to what you know. But once your defensive wall goes off, it's something called an amygdala hijack, which is part of neuroscience. So your brain triggers, and we call it a defensive wall because you feel the emotional reaction inside. You actually physically feel it. Once you do that, you're in survival mode. And it's less about what you know. It's more about how do I survive in the environment I'm in? And this is where our brain makes some very deliberate choices. Part of that fight or flight is one of those subconscious choices that gets made. But that threat position, if you think about the world around you, we are, because of the stress levels that we're under, we see threats much, much, much more readily. It can be a phrase, it can be a wording in an email. That threat response, you can be in an environment where teams, we have a business and one of our clients, and literally it feels like everybody is permanently under that threat response. Now that's the assumption that we make in Irrational Change. We also look, and we call it the defensive wall because it's easier to sort of work with. We look at how you can create change that what we call is it stays below the threat threshold. So don't trigger the threat, don't trigger the defensive wall, because once you've triggered it, you are in trouble because it triggers very quickly, but it takes a long time to come down.
Right.
Because the minute you've triggered it and the threat is seen, trust is lost. And the minute my brain has identified you as being a threat, it's really hard to unwire your brain from something that you believe to being a threat and to see it as being a positive again. So a lot of what we do, a lot of the strategies we use is about how you stay below that threat threshold.
So is the idea that a change is happening, something registers in our amygdala, and then strategy is to immediately try to alleviate any threat in the amygdala and move people into at least think about the change in the prefrontal cortex, which is where rational thinking happens. Is that what it is?
So I'm going to say, actually, it works a bit deeper than that.
Sure, I know. I'm simplifying it. Yeah.
No. When I say deeper, it's not. So one of the things that also differentiates us is we look at why we make choices in an organizational context. And as humans, the choices we make at work may be very different to the choices we make at home. They're two different processing sets, if that makes sense. The choices we make at work, if you understand what influences our choices at work, you can then see why I will see a threat or not see a threat. Now, for us, we know it's not down to the individual. In the working context, the individual and our own needs and our own beliefs are actually not our biggest driver of the choices that we make. We're more influenced by the tribes that are around us. Now, I use the word tribes, and I don't mean this in the sense, I mean this in the anthropological sense, which is a group of people coming together that have a common shared belief rather than anything else. But we are more influenced by our tribes and our safety than anything else. So we will see threats through the lens of our safety and our tribes, not by our own choices. Now, our tribes, every tribe has a leader. This is something we call the moment of choice. And when we're looking at irrational change, we focus on that moment of choice, which is where does the value get realized? It's not everybody in your project, the first spoiler alert. There are some individuals who are the crux of the value, which may be a salesman having a different conversation with a customer. It may be a procurement guy having a different conversation with a vendor. There's a point where your value gets realized. They are the people whose behavior shift is the most important to realizing your value. So we focus in on that, laser-guided missile. Now, we know the tribes are the first layer of influence. So I am most likely, inclusion and exclusion is a massive driver of human behavior. And I want to stay included in my tribe. So my tribe is a massive dynamic of that. Now, every tribe has a leader, whether they are position appointed or whether they are implied. Every tribe has a leader. If you've ever seen teenagers in the street as a group together, you can work out who the leader is. It's not the noisiest or the most loud one. There's somebody everybody checks to for what is the socially acceptable behaviors of this group. And humans are super flexible. We swap between tribes and we swap our behaviors very, very quickly. It's part of our survival tactic.
Yeah.
Now, outside of your tribe, the role of a leader in a tribe is to keep the tribe safe. And safety is one of your biggest drives. Now, and I don't mean psychological safety. I mean the basics of job security and financial safety.
You're right.
It's not as sexy as psychological safety. Now, outside of that, you get this thing called competing priorities. So all the competing priorities that come in. Outside of that, you get the environment, which is your culture, your history, and all of the other stuff. Now, in the world of irrational change, we understand every single layer that radiates out from the individual. Now, what we know is if we try and change an individual, it's like pushing water uphill. It will only work if there's congruence between the tribal layer, the leadership layer, the competing priorities layer, and the environmental layer. So we shift the environment, and create the space that then it leads you to a decision. It leads you to choices where you don't feel threatened.
But that's part of the
individual. Yeah. It's more about creating an environment that encourages the change to happen deliberately.
Yeah.
Same way that you do user interfaces in applications. There's a different upside down way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about makes complete sense. I think definitely in each tribe, they are leaders. They don't have the authority, but they have. There's a saying in leadership that the people that lead the team emotionally are the real leaders. And so even if there's somebody with authority, but they don't lead them emotionally, and that's why you're talking about those kind of people. They're not bad. In fact, if we rationalize with them sometimes, they will help us with the messaging. So that's one. And the second thing, you're talking about the environment, definitely modifying the environment or changing it or managing it. It's one type of nudge to facilitate better adoption of the change.
You mentioned something there, Ali, just to pick you up. You mentioned me rationalizing with the tribe. And the reason why we call these tribes rather than teams is that teams lead you down a path of assuming that the org structure matches up the tribal dynamics, and it often doesn't.
Right, yeah.
That's the reason why we use tribe. You mentioned about rationalizing with them. So yes, we target the tribal leaders because the tribal leaders get the outcomes they deserve, their behavior, they set the social norms for the group, they set the levels of safety, they do all of that stuff. Inherently, or whether they realize it or not, that's what they do. But you mentioned about rationalizing with them, and actually we would suggest that a tribal leader is more irrational than most because they carry more of the stress than most. And actually just rationalizing with any human is less likely to be successful. You might get awareness, you might get awareness, they might know something, but it's that knowing doing gap. And to move to the doing side, we have to appeal to the irrational instead.
Yeah.
So rational arguments rarely work. You have to appeal to the irrational, that emotional side of things. You have to create that emotion. And without that emotion, you're going nowhere.
I think David Rock mentioned in one of his books, I think Your Brain at Work is the name of the book. He mentioned that you talked about that piece of rationalization with the leaders. And I think his observation is that you will never get to a stage where you're going to rationalize, but at least if we can get them to a stage where they are neutral, you can have a better conversation in there rather than completely being logical about things. And you make a point around they are under stress, and so they're less likely to actually fully rationalize on a lot of things. There's a speed of decisions, there's the environment, there's competing priorities, plus there's a change in a project that is actually taking a lot of their energy and time. And at the end of the day, they would need to basically face the music with their team. And that's, I think that's where the stress happens.
So the thing that's really fascinating in most of our clients, and I'll come back to conviction level, the thing that's really fascinating is when we go into clients, we know that, most leaders are most teams, most individuals in an organization are constantly triaging the priorities based on the signals they're being given.
Yes.
They're taking all the signals and they're trying to work, what do I need to do to not get fired? And that sounds really harsh, but safety and job security is a massive, massive driver of what we do and what we don't do. Now, when it comes to leaders, it's really fascinating because we believe in something called conviction. And conviction is the passionate belief in something. It's not neutral. It's the passionate belief in something. If I was to take an irrational plan, and this is going to be a bit of a mind funk for you, is, classic thing is scope, time, resources. Well, if you take away time, and don't get me wrong, scope, time, resources will get you to a great product, a new process, a new organization structure, a new insight platform, the product. But your value doesn't get realized by delivering a product. Your value gets realized by the adoption of that product. When you're looking at adoption runs at the speed of conviction of your leaders. Because if you convert a leader, if the leader of the tribe thinks something is important, then guess what? The rest of the tribe will follow behind it because that's part of their safety needs.
Yeah.
If I don't support what the boss thinks is great, it's not going to follow behind it. So for us, the heart of irrational change is identifying the right tribal leaders, identifying the stuff that's going around that is diverting their attention in order to build the conviction, because we know that without conviction, nothing is going to happen.
Yeah.
And by conviction, I mean enough emotional belief in something.
You're right.
Emotional belief that when competing priorities come in, I am still going to go for this change. That when other things, that I may have to sacrifice some of my other deliverables in order for this to happen. Now, irrational change is all about that conviction and building it, not just awareness, not just a rational understanding, because if we don't have that leadership conviction, we don't have a change. Now, we understand humans, so we apply the same behavioral biases, the same deep understanding of humans to the leaders as we do to every others. We treat them one-on-one. We measure conviction. We have analytic tools that do that. We measure whether a leader has enough conviction. In fact, we would not ask them to even attempt to lead. It's totally dangerous. You get one chance to make a great first impression. We would never ask a leader to lead anything unless they had the emotional conviction level ready to lead. So we focus in there, and we've got a methodology that helps you assess it, build it, and then guide and coach it through.
I think
it's like a laser guided missile at the right point.
You're right, yeah. I think
why doesn't everybody else do this?
I think you were mentioning conviction, and I think you talk about the 3 C's, which is the capacity, competency, and capability, capacity, and conviction. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of our sort of things, and actually this came from my co-creator Nick. We rewrote the laws of physics, and we have an equation we use called E equals mc cubed. So that's the laws of physics. E is execution, and we call this strategic execution. And in fact, if you're in the field of change management, just one thing to be aware of, and you might want to think about, is we never use the word change management because it's a commoditized thing. We always use strategy execution. So your ability to execute your strategy is based on 2 things. One is your M, motivation. And motivation comes down to this moment of choice and these layers that we talked about. Yeah. And the second one is the 3 constraints of leadership: capacity, conviction, and capability. Now, capacity, our leaders are capacity constrained, just like everyone else. Capability, our leaders never, ever, ever go to leadership school. They haven't been trained. In fact, the worst thing of all, Ali, is they've been trained by every other project team that went before them. So what you're seeing is the product of every other project that's happened before and how poorly they've trained their leaders. The third one is conviction. Now, if I had to pick any one of those 3 that makes the mega difference, it's always conviction. Yeah. Because if I have conviction, I will build or buy the capability. If I have conviction, I will find capacity. If on any of your projects you have ever struggled to get a mobilization of resources, guess what? That's a sign of poor conviction. Leaders who've got resources, whether that's budget or people, they can make, and I know this because I used to be one of these guys, and I know you did too. As a leader, you have access to resources. You can make a decision in the moment to allocate resources to something. You are choosing not to. And that's the big thing for us. It's not about whether you're able to, it's whether you're willing to. And we focus in on the willingness because humans are really smart. Ability is rarely ever an issue. It's the willingness to do something. And it's the willingness we have to shift.
Whilst you were talking about the leadership, I was thinking, what would be one strategy you will follow? Because when you approach a leader and you've got a change, And by the way, I like definitely the terminology you use, because sometimes some organizations actually like to hear the word or the term change management because they would like to think that somebody's going to help with that. But I'm with you. I come from a leadership background. It's all about the execution. And anybody can come up with ideas. Anybody can come up with books or frameworks. And, that's why Elon Musk has got, the coding for his cars all online. It's like anybody can have it, but you won't be able to make his product. It's all about the execution. So these are the industry secrets. When we approach a leader, and so obviously you've got ways to measure or gauge their conviction level, maybe from historical data, from feedback from the leaders, and all of those things. Can you grow it?
Yes. Oh my gosh, we build it from scratch.
Yes. And what would it talking about how this particular implementation will help them be more successful, better for the community, better for the clients, or is it a different approach?
No. I wish it was. I wish we could just say, look, this is great for your company, just do it. But you know what?
Yes.
Most leaders have so many competing priorities that they're trading off between them.
Yes.
So we go out and do a few things. The first thing, and this is what I learned. This is what I learned about 10, 12 years ago. And I used to run an underground course or an underground capability building for mid-level leaders in my corporate organization, which was called How to Lead Change. And it was simply basically a how can I help you understand what's being asked of you? Right, let's start at the beginning. The first one is leaders are humans first. You cannot lead a change unless you believe in the change.
Yeah.
So it's dangerous. If you've ever been asked to lead a change, corporate communication comes down, tomorrow we're announcing this, you need to show up as a leader. Every single one of your team can see, and if you excuse the language, bullshit that comes out of that.
Yeah.
One of the things that the modern world, our survival tactics, we see, and let's be honest, there are so many other data points out there, we can see whether you genuinely believe or not. So as humans, our survival is based on, do I genuinely believe you believe in something or not? And I get so much visibility, I can tell or not. So for us, the first thing to do is to bring you through that change curve. So we treat you as an individual first. We treat you as a change target first. So the first thing we work on this, and remember, I said about the moment of choice, leaders have bosses too. Even if you're the CEO of a company, you have bosses too. And in fact, we worked with the CEO and exec team a while back, and their shareholders obviously did not agree with what they were doing. And you could tell it was showing up in the way they behaved. So everybody has a boss.
Everybody's got a boss.
Your CEO has a boss. Whether it's family owned, whatever it is, everybody has a boss. Now, so recognize that tribal dynamic again, which is what are the influences coming on me as a leader? So if I'm a mid-level leader and I'm expected to lead a change, I am not going to lead this if my boss doesn't think it's important.
Yeah.
So I have to work my way up to it's why I always end up at the CEO typically, or at the top level, somewhere high enough up that every change target is within that structure. So the first thing we do is we create the environment for that leader to feel that this is a priority. Because if they don't feel it's a priority, the tribe doesn't come with them. Simple as that. The second thing we do is we have this trick. And again, this is where our behavioral science comes in. So we use every trick in the book to try and make things easy. Remember, leaders are cognitively overloaded just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
One of our techniques is something called the leader story. Now, if you see it on paper, you look at it and go, yeah, that's really basic. It's a communication exercise. We ask, what's the change? What does it mean to the team? What's not changing? Really important for grounding your team. Why are we doing this? It's 5 really simple questions. But what differentiates the way we do it is we don't leave that until the very last minute, because we know that putting a leader on the stand at the very last minute and asking them to do something and asking to lead a change, their brain isn't ready for it. We have to warm them up in advance. So quite early on in the process, we identify who the change leaders are going to be. And change leader has nothing to do with the project. It's those that lead the targets of the change. So nothing to do with your project. In fact, the most dangerous person in your room is your design sponsor, who's got the money and the resources to put something together because they've got no authority typically. They're the most dangerous person in the room. They think their passion will achieve everything. They won't. They'll achieve nothing. Anyway, so we use this technique called the leader story. Now, what we tend to do is and there's a trick, because when you say to a leader, okay, let's start thinking about how we're going to talk about this change. the first thing they'll say to you is, can you write me some bullet points? Can you write me some headlines that I can use? Because they've been trained by every other project team that's gone before you that you're going to write their comms for them. Well, we don't. Yeah. Because if we write your comms for you, it's not an authentic message. So instead, we turn it around. And actually, we use a vehicle a little bit like this, Ali, if I'm honest. In our modern day world, we say, look, we're going to do some videos, we're going to do some podcasts. We'd like your team to hear you. It needs to be your voice, your authentic message.
Yeah.
We're going to have like exactly the same way that you would with when your audience, with when your guests, you say, here's 4 or 5 questions that we're going to ask you. We say, we're going to record this maybe next Thursday. So give them a weekend to think about it, to mull it all over. Now, what are we doing? We're doing a forcing function at a point in time when this change is not a threat, because we're not implementing yet. So it's not a threat yet. Yeah, I don't feel threatened. I don't feel that I'm being pushed up against a wall. It's early enough in time. These 4 or 5 questions are designed partly to communicate to their teams, but really because we're asking the leader to say, what do I know? What do I think? Let me check in. Let me take some time, because I've got a podcast coming up and I don't want to look like an idiot. Yeah. But let me take some time to think about what I think about this. What do I really think about it? Because most leaders give most changes very little airtime in their brain, simply because they don't have time to give it. They back end it to the last minute, and then they're all a bit, mixed up because they're trying to do it very quickly. Now, that's simple leader story. And actually, we would not let a leader lead a change unless we are happy that their internal self-talk, their internal story is good enough for them to lead the change. Because humans in our modern day world cannot hide. You can't fake it till you make it on stuff like this.
No.
So this simple technique happens way up front when it's not a threat. We record it, but the real art of this is not the recording. It's not the communication at the end, but it's about the thought process that they've gone through to say, why is this important to us? What is this going to mean to my team? It's really powerful, really simple. One of our clients, before they even became a client of ours, took the leader's story. The CEO took the leader's story, a massive transformation in the financial industry. He took the leader's story and he handed it out to each one of his executive team and said, this is coming. This is absolutely going to happen. It's being driven by the industry. We've got no choice. I want you to go away, fill this in. We're going to talk about it in 3 weeks' time. He basically became the change agent for this and step changed the conviction levels, the awareness levels, the emotional connection levels of his team. 3 of them came back and said, look, I'll be honest with you, I actually can't answer these questions. I don't know what it's going to mean to me. And that is a valuable data point to have.
Yeah. From your observation, have you noticed anything around industries? So certain industries accept change perhaps better. Is it because, like, for example, the technology companies, they're probably more adept to evolving, for example, than, let's just say, I don't know, higher education or transport or something like that, or government agencies. What's your observation?
So it's really fascinating. When we started our advisory business, the first thing we did was we went out to try as many industry as possible to test the theory that we had around irrational change and say, does it work in industry? And actually, I would say, and we went across geography, we went across industry to say, is this consistent? The reality is humans are humans and humans are very predictable. Our observation is it's less about industry. It's more about culture. It's more about the culture of the organization. Now, if you've got a command and control culture, the chances are you probably have a little less flexibility, but it's very command and control, and you treat your humans as robots. We believe there's 2 ends of a spectrum. At that end of the spectrum, you treat your humans as robots. Somebody centrally determines the process and everybody else follows it. Yeah. In times like that, humans don't put a lot of thought into it. They follow the process. It's very highly, highly regulated. Now, on the other end of the side, you've got what we call trust the people rather than trust the process. On the trust the people organizations, these tend to be the ones that have got their ex-family companies. They've been built up from family companies. The tech often have this. It's all about the relationship. It's all about trust the people. Now, the trust the people ones, and this is what brought us back to a really big insight, which is that change happens at the speed of trust. In trust the process, and the great organizations out there, I think Procter & Gamble is a good one that gets mentioned when it comes to the manufacturing guys. I think General Electric used to be very much in that scale as well, where literally central process, it just changes through command and control on your way through. Now, on the other side of things, any organization where it's trust the people You have to get to a tipping point. And the tipping point isn't bottom up. The tipping point is top down. When the minute a leader buys into a change, genuinely buys into it, the rest of their tribe will come with them. So in answer to your question, it's not industry focused, it's cultural. And it's cultural based on structure and background and history of the organization.
Yes, yep. And culture comes from the set of behaviors and practices within an organization and the leadership of that organization, obviously.
Culture comes from leaders. If you, we subscribe to the great work, and Ed Shine, who is just amazing. He passed away, I think, 10 days ago, but he is the godfather of culture. And we subscribe to a lot of what he says, which is actually it's the socially acceptable behaviors of the organization.
Yeah.
And culture is only changed by two things. The first one is crisis. Very, very few organizations have a genuine crisis, and you can't create a crisis. We see through the sense of urgency. We see through that now. We have better data points. We can see straight through it. It's either crisis or it's leadership, which was what the insight that drove us to focus in on the tribes and tribal leadership outside the individual.
Yeah.
Because if we shift the socially acceptable behaviors of the tribe, then believe me, humans will naturally adapt their tribes because that's our basic survival mechanism.
Yeah, but crises have got this impact on humans. The crises actually sometimes define our identities, and when that happens, then there's always going to be a shift in the way we look at things. And I want to shift gear and talk about, you've got your own sentiment about the current change management frameworks, and so talk to me about it. Do they need upgrades? What's your take? And what is the
so it's really
what's your framework? What's your alternative?
So it's really fascinating, and I wish I'd never, ever, ever had to go out with Irrational Change and say, "Look, guys, there's a different way of doing change." I wish it wasn't me that had to do that. What do I think? I think a lot of frameworks. Humans like rationality. We like to believe if we start at A, we're going to get to D and E and F, and it's going to be very predictable. Humans love predictability. Yeah. It makes us feel in control. My frustration, I think, with the big frameworks that are out there is they assume a level of rationality. Yeah. They assume that if you create awareness, you're going to create the knowledge, you're going to create the desire, and it's going to be a natural thing. Whereas we look at it differently and say, there are so many things that are pulling against that. There are so many things that however much I get it, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to change my behavior. You have to look at it differently. Yeah. For us, the second thing as well is there's an awful lot of focusing on the individual, whether they're going to, and change does happen at an individual level, but that individual level can be influenced at the tribal level. And for us, it's that focus at the tribal level that makes the difference. Yeah. So two things that matter. The first one is we assume everyone is cognitively overloaded. We assume that they are not rational. We assume that they're entirely irrational, and therefore you need to take that irrationality into account. The second one then for us is, although change happens an individual changes, what influences them most is their tribal behaviors. Yeah. And the more you focus at the tribal level, the more you understand tribal dynamics, which again are super predictable, and they are entirely visible in the observable behaviors as well. Yeah. The more you focus on that and get really, really great at engineering tribal behaviors, the more likely you are to bring a change about and realize your value. And at the moment, I'll be honest as well, I'm seeing a lot of old school comms that believe posters work. They don't work. You're not going to create an emotional change from a mass communication. So we're looking, in my sense, we're looking in the wrong place with a lot of them. Yeah. And we're focusing at the wrong level. Yeah,
look, I actually interviewed both the Pro-Sci people and the Kata people. And to their credit, they've started looking at exactly what you're talking about, how they look at their frameworks and upgrade them. I'm with you around, we almost want to believe that it's a linear process, but it never happens. And I think Kota says create a sense of urgency. That's easier. If you're going to look at the whole workplace nowadays, there's a lot of urgencies everywhere and what we call competing priorities. I'm with you on everything you're talking about. I think I would like to think that I'm rational. I'm not. I keep I keep finding ways to bring me back to the neutral space, at least, so I can, have some insight, and then I can look at the picture from another angle. But I'm a human, and sometimes I default into inherent biases that I have. The good news about us is that those of us who are really self-aware, we recognize when that happens, and then because we are responsible about delivering a service to the clients, or even in the family, like when I realize that there's something that I'm not really quite going to be rational about with my own son, I pause and I find different ways to actually reset for me, to actually look at the thing in a different dynamic. Sometimes I just go for a run. Sometimes I just go for a walk. We need to do what we need to do, but we don't assume that everybody's got that capability. And look, people get threatened by change. I mean, it's a normal thing and it's not a bad thing. People deal with things differently. We are coming close to the end of the podcast. I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. You inspired me about a couple of things. Definitely, it's worth a book for you, Ed, to write something like "Change Happens at the Speed of Trust." I think that's a great thing. I think that's fantastic.
It's funny, actually, 'cause we've talked about a book so many times, and but at the moment we're so passionate about getting the word out there. So we've one of the things we do is we actually post under Irrational Change. If you ever Google it or look us up on LinkedIn, we post a daily cartoon. We've been posting a daily cartoon since January 2020. Yes. It's one of those things that got out of hand.
I've gone through your material. That's why I was
amazing. And we put some really great insight. We don't hold anything back. So we put some really great insight there. So they're free for you to do. Now, we know we've got over 75,000 words attached to those daily cartoons.
Yeah.
We save the text. Yeah. We actually do have some great workbooks. At some point there will be a book, but at the moment, our passion as an organization, this is sort of like the side of what we do. Our passion as an organization is to help any change agent out there work smarter, not harder, because the level of abuse that change agents get where they're expected to achieve the impossible, well, we want to help you make that possible. We want to help any change agent work smarter, not harder, and achieve the value and the successes that you deserve. But work smarter, not harder. Use the research we use. We pull from anthropology. We pull from neuroscience. We pull from child development. It's a lot in child development right now, as well as psychology, behavioral science, and all the others. We're basically steal from wherever we possibly can to give you brain hacks, you really great tactics that look really simple, but actually deliver a massive bang for their buck.
And there's a lot of research nowadays about neurodiversity, Ed. So coming out every single day, and some organizations are good to use them, especially marketing organizations. And I certainly I read a lot about it, and some information will validate what I know already. Some information will challenge what I already know, and some of them will add new information to go and test it and see how it works. The final question I usually ask the guests is what would be your advice to the change management community?
So if I had to give you some advice, what would I say? The first one is change happens at the speed of trust. Yeah, change is a human thing. So you have to build the relationships. Your leaders are getting the outcomes they deserve. It's not the teams, it's the leaders. And leaders rarely understand that because they've never been to leadership school. And the third piece I'd probably say, if I had to, is leadership conviction. You cannot outrun poor leadership conviction. And by leadership, I mean leadership of your change targets, not your design sponsor who's got the money and the resources to build something.
Fantastic. That particular piece about conviction probably will have you again at some stage later in the year to talk really more and unpack that particular word. It's been a pleasure having you in my podcast. Ed, how would people reach you?
LinkedIn is probably the best thing. Look for Edwina Pike, so full name Edwina Pike, or check us out on Irrational Change. We're both on LinkedIn. Also, we've got a great website as well. We also run some free webinars and some free intros and masterclasses. So if this has intrigued you, pop along to one of our free masterclasses, and we'll go a little bit deeper into things like E=mc³ and some of the theories that we use, so you can get a real good taster for what we do.
Fantastic. Please invite me to the freebies. And I certainly will be there. We will put all the information about you, Ed, on the podcast when we publish it. But it's been a pleasure having you in the Irrational Change podcast. Ed, until next time, stay well and stay safe.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember, subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next podcast. Until then, stay well and stay safe.